The year is 1563. Under a torrential rain in the streets of Bursa, an elderly, frail woman is walking. Soaking wet, her hands tremble from the freezing cold. Threatened with eviction by her landlord because she cannot pay the rent, the local merchants won't even sell her a loaf of bread on credit. Looking at her now, no one could believe she was once the second most powerful woman in the world's greatest empire. She was the first favorite of Suleiman the Magnificent, the emperor who made Europe tremble. And she was the mother of the legendary Prince Mustafa, the man everyone believed was destined for the throne, Mahidevran Hatun. She lost everything. Not just her palace or her crown. She sacrificed her most precious possession, her only son, to the silk ropes of the deaf executioners inside his own father's tent. That day, as she felt her son take his final breath just outside the tent, this mother found herself at the absolute epicenter of the most ruthless power struggle history has ever witnessed. From the slave markets to the absolute peak of the empire, and finally crashing down into the muddy streets of Bursa. This unparalleled tragedy is the most brutal proof of a mother's fight for survival behind the golden walls of the Ottoman Palace. To get lost in the dusty, dark corners of history and to discover with us just how dangerous the poison of power truly is. Don't forget to subscribe to History Whispers. Turn off the lights. Because in this story, no one is innocent. Chapter 1. From a 4-coin slave to the peak. For centuries, popular culture sold us a comforting myth, portraying Mahidevran Hatun as a noble Circassian princess offered to the Ottoman palace as a grand diplomatic gift. But history is rarely that kind, and the Ottoman Empire did not build its foundation on fairy tales. The ruthless archival records tear this illusion to pieces. No 16th century noble dynasty would allow their daughter to be humiliated in a slave market, thrown into a crowded dormitory with captive girls, and put on a meager daily wage by the palace bureaucracy. The truth is, she entered the royal household as a kidnapped slave, violently torn from her home in the Caucasus or Crimea. In 1513, when Sultan Suleiman was just a young governor in Manisa, his harem was already established. This secluded world housed 17 concubines, all vying for a single glance from the future emperor. Contrary to popular belief, young Mahidevran was not the queen of this harem. The meticulously kept Manisa Palace expense ledgers from September 1513 expose the cutthroat hierarchy within these stone walls. Every woman's worth was strictly calculated and recorded in ink. These ledgers reveal a harsh reality. While Suleiman's first 3 absolute favorites received a highly respected stipend of 5 silver coins a day, Mahidevran's daily wage was a mere 4 coins. She was a secondary figure. In that hyper-competitive era, a single coin difference was as brutal as the status gap between a corporate CEO and a minimum wage worker today. But in 1515, the balance of power shifted overnight. Mahidevran, whose Persian name translated to "the beauty that never fades," gave birth to her only son, Prince Mustafa. With the cry of this newborn boy, her status skyrocketed. She was instantly elevated from a simple 4-coin concubine to the sacred mother of a royal prince. Yet, there was no room for romantic love in Ottoman dynastic politics. The sole duty of a mother was to raise her child to be the future emperor. According to the strict one concubine, one son rule, Mahidevran's romantic relationship with Suleiman permanently ended the day she held her son. She was forced into a mandatory, lifelong sexual retirement. When Suleiman's father died in 1520, the young prince ascended the throne as Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. He marched his household to Istanbul. Mahidevran and her young son Mustafa moved into the luxurious old palace. The sheer grandeur of the capital and the whispers of ultimate power only sharpened Mahidevran's political ambitions. Just a year after their arrival, a devastating smallpox outbreak swept through the city and breached the palace walls. The disease ruthlessly claimed the lives of Suleiman's other young sons, Mahmud and Murad. While the Sultan wept for his heirs, this horrific tragedy was an absolute political blessing for Mahidevran. Death had violently cleared the path of all her rivals. Almost overnight, Prince Mustafa became the Sultan's only surviving son and the sole uncontested heir to the greatest empire on earth. As long as her son breathed, Mahidevran's future as the Queen Mother was practically guaranteed. Mahidevran was no longer just a mother, she was an institution. She was widely recognized as the second most powerful woman in the empire. Walking through the golden corridors of Topkapi Palace, draped in priceless jewels, she felt completely untouchable, secure in her divine royal destiny. Until the confident footsteps of another young slave echoed through the silent harem corridors. A red-haired Russian girl brought on a slave ship from the Black Sea. A woman who recognized no historical rules, knew no boundaries, and absolutely refused to accept the established hierarchy. She was destined to bring Mahidevran's perfectly constructed world crashing down. Her name was Hurrem. Chapter 2. Traitor, Cheap Flesh. The War for Survival. In 1521, when Hurrem Sultan walked through the heavy gates of the imperial harem, the invincible throne Mahidevran had carefully built began to tremble. Hurrem was no ordinary woman. She possessed a lethal charm and a terrifyingly hypnotic influence over the emperor. She arrived ready to burn all the traditional rules of the Ottoman palace to the ground. That very same year, defying all expectations, Hurrem gave birth to Prince Mehmed. Then, breaking the strict one concubine, one son rule, she shockingly remained in the Sultan's bedchamber. She soon gave birth to Selim, Bayezid, and Jahangir. Hurrem's rapid succession of male heirs permanently shattered Mahidevran's monopoly as the sole mother of the dynasty's future. A 1526 confidential diplomatic report by the Venetian ambassador, Bragadin, brutally summarized the new reality. Suleiman has completely forgotten Mahidevran and given all of his immense love entirely to Hurrem. Mahidevran was no longer just a heartbroken, abandoned woman in the shadows. She was a mother caught in a terrifying existential crisis for her child's future. In the bloody gears of the Ottoman political machine, only one prince could ascend the golden throne. And the one who did was legally obligated by the brutal law of fratricide to execute all of his brothers. Mahidevran's seething fury towards Hurrem wasn't merely the jealousy of a discarded lover. It was a desperate, life-or-death war to prevent the future execution of her beloved son, Mustafa. This unbearable stress and relentless paranoia reached its violent boiling point in 1533. Refusing to accept the loss of her hierarchical standing and her son's birthright, a fiercely proud and exhausted Mahidevran finally snapped. She lunged at Hurrem in the dark harem corridors, sparking one of the most infamous physical brawls in the history of the Ottoman Empire. According to the scandalous reports of Venetian envoy Bernardo Navagero, the confrontation was savage. Mahidevran fiercely scratched Hurrem's face, tore her silk clothes, and screamed words that echoed like thunder through the palace walls. "Traitor! You cheap flesh! Do you honestly think you can compete with me?" It was the raw scream of a mother watching her world collapse. But this uncontrollable outburst of anger was exactly the golden opportunity Hurrem had been waiting for. With lethal political brilliance, she masterfully spun this assault into a devastating checkmate. Claiming her face was horribly scarred and that she could not possibly appear before the Sultan as cheap, battered flesh, she shockingly outright refused Suleiman's direct invitation to his chambers. Enraged by this unprecedented rejection, Sultan Suleiman immediately summoned Mahidevran to demand an explanation. But instead of apologizing, Mahidevran stood incredibly tall and openly rebelled against the emperor. "I didn't do enough to her. All the women here should step on her," she declared to his face, effectively signing her own political death warrant in that very moment. Suleiman the Magnificent, a man who dictated the fate of Europe, never forgave such an unforgivable public show of disrespect. He erased Mahidevran from his heart completely and ordered her immediate banishment from the capital. The woman who was once the undisputed queen of his heart was now discarded like a broken sword. In 1533, Mahidevran departed for the distant province of Manisa alongside her 18-year-old son, Mustafa, who was being sent to officially train as a provincial governor. While the palace publicly framed it as a standard princely appointment, make no mistake, this was an undeniable, humiliating official exile. She was being cast out of the capital, far away from the epicenter of ultimate power. As her carriage rolled out of the Topkapi Palace gates, Hurrem Sultan had definitively won the brutal war. She was now the undisputed master of the imperial harem. Shortly after, she would break centuries of strict Ottoman tradition by legally marrying the emperor in a spectacular public ceremony, ascending from a mere captive slave to the unprecedented status of Haseki Sultan, the true imperial queen. But there was one crucial thing Hurrem did not know. The exiled Mahidevran had not surrendered. On the contrary, she was shedding her outdated role as a mere palace concubine and transforming into a ruthless, hardened political survivor. She was now ready to break every rule in the book, build powerful alliances, and fight a new kind of war to ensure her son would one day sit on the throne. Chapter 3. A Mother's Shield. The Amasya Intelligence Network. In 1541, when Hurrem's eldest son, Mehmed, was suddenly appointed to Manisa, a position reserved for the crown prince, the empire witnessed a massive political earthquake. Mahidevran and Prince Mustafa were abruptly relocated to the distant province of Amasya. While the court framed it as a standard transfer, it was undeniably an official exile. Yet, in Amasya, Mahidevran was about to establish a heavily fortified shadow empire. Italian traveller Luigi Bassano wrote that Mustafa's breathtaking palace in Amasya was so wealthy it rivaled his father's grand court. The elite provincial army absolutely worshipped this young prince, who stood out with his martial prowess, military genius, and striking resemblance to his grandfather, Selim the Grim. He was a true warrior king in waiting. But in the whisper-filled corridors of the capital, this glorious military reputation was perceived as a lethal threat. Mahidevran, a hardened veteran of palace politics, knew this perfectly well. Her role was no longer just that of a gentle chaperone mother. Evolving into a paranoid political strategist, she took on the heavy responsibilities of a ruthless chief of intelligence to keep her son alive. According to the confidential reports of Venetian ambassador Bernardo Navaggero, Mahidevran demonstrated a terrifying vigilance to protect her only heir. Realizing the capital was swarming with Hurrem's loyalists, she managed a vast, flawless network of elite spies and silent informants, stretching from the bustling markets of Istanbul to the snowy mountains of Amasya. Every diplomatic envoy arriving from the capital, every wealthy merchant entering the palace, and even every lowly scullery boy working in the kitchens was secretly monitored. They were brutally interrogated by her men and thrown into deep dungeons at the slightest hint of suspicion. Mahidevran had essentially built a perfect counter-espionage agency in the heart of Anatolia. The suffocating paranoia of poisoning was so extreme in Amasya that Mahidevran absolutely refused to let the palace chefs near her son. She personally prepared all of Prince Mustafa's meals herself, or stubbornly tasted every single bite before it reached his lips to thwart assassination attempts. She had literally become a walking shield of flesh and blood. However, as the formidable faction of Hurrem Sultan and Grand Vizier Rustem Pasha grew overwhelmingly strong, Mustafa was not remaining passive. According to Ottoman historian Zahit Atçıl, this highly organized shadow state in Amasya had begun to actively forge its own aggressive strategy to definitively secure the throne upon Suleiman's eventual passing. Relying on his immense popularity, Mustafa was building his own powerful alliances among respected scholars and influential provincial governors. He was engaged in secret correspondence with Ayas Pasha, the powerful governor of Erzurum, and dangerously dispatched his own private envoy, Nebi Bey, to Venice to secure logistical support in a succession crisis. Mahidevran, operating with the cautious brilliance of a master spy, knew perfectly well that these bold political maneuvers would inevitably trigger his aging father's immense paranoia. She constantly warned him to be careful, but Mustafa, fiercely proud since childhood, relied entirely on the unwavering, passionate love of his soldiers and his people. His ruthless enemies in the capital were patiently waiting for exactly this fatal miscalculation. Mustafa's growing overconfidence and highly independent diplomatic moves would soon provide Hurrem Sultan and Rustem Pasha with all the heavy political ammunition they desperately needed to convince the paranoid Sultan that his son was plotting an armed rebellion. The formidable intelligence network Mahidevran had so painstakingly built in Amasya had already begun to hear the deafening footsteps of a massive political storm. Secret letters were intercepted, loyal couriers disappeared in the night, and a terrifying silence fell over the communication lines with the capital. The trap was finally closing. But the terrifying web of betrayal being woven in the dark chambers of Istanbul was ruthless enough to pierce even the strongest mother's shield. For both factions, there was absolutely no turning back now. The pieces were set, the swords were drawn in the shadows, and the stakes were absolute. It was either the golden throne or the executioner's rope. Chapter 4. Shattered Pillars and the Web of Betrayal. No matter how far she was physically exiled from the epicenter of power in the capital, Mahidevran possessed one colossal, virtually invincible political shield at the palace. Sultan Suleiman's lifelong companion and absolute second-in-command, Grand Vizier Pargali Ibrahim Pasha. Against the rapidly growing, formidable Hurrem Rustem alliance, Mahidevran, her son Prince Mustafa, and Ibrahim Pasha formed an indestructible political wall of flesh and steel that no one dared to cross. This alliance was not merely a cold, calculated political transaction born out of necessity. An incredibly intimate, surviving letter written by Mahidevran to Ibrahim Pasha's wife, Musin Hatun, stands as the greatest historical proof of the deep, genuine bonds of brotherhood and mutual trust between the two powerful families. As long as Ibrahim remained alive and in power, Mustafa's path to the throne was guaranteed. Until that incredibly dark, blood-soaked night in March 1536, when the all-powerful Pargali Ibrahim Pasha was suddenly strangled in his sleep by the silent executioners upon Suleiman's direct, unforgiving order. It wasn't just a Grand Vizier who died. Mahidevran's greatest and only remaining pillar of support was utterly shattered into 1,000,000 pieces in a single instant. When the devastating, horrific news of this midnight execution finally reached the distant mountains of Amasya, Mahidevran knew perfectly well what it meant. She was now completely alone, exposed and utterly defenseless against Hurrem Sultan and the cunning new Grand Vizier, Rustem Pasha, at the ruthless, unforgiving wolves' table in the capital. In Ibrahim's sudden absence, Hurrem and her brilliant son-in-law Rustem launched a flawless, terrifying psychological war that would patiently last for years. Their primary, lethal goal was to repeatedly trigger the aging sultan's deepest insecurities by spreading persistent rumors that the massive imperial army and the elite janissaries desperately wanted to see young, vigorous Mustafa on the throne instead of him. This lethal, highly calculated game of shadows would go down in Ottoman history as Mekli Rustem, the dark trick of Rustem. In a stroke of sinister genius, Rustem Pasha secretly commissioned a master artisan to forge an indistinguishable, perfect metal replica of Prince Mustafa's personal imperial seal in a dark, fiery workshop. With this perfectly forged seal, fake, highly treasonous letters were secretly sent to the Ottoman Empire's absolute greatest enemy, Shah Tahmasp of Persia, officially asking for his massive military support to aggressively overthrow Suleiman. Naturally, the Shah's positive, welcoming response to this treasonous offer was intercepted en route by Rustem's pre-positioned spies. And this incredibly dangerous forged letter, carrying the devastating words, "Your son covets your throne and the army wants him," was placed directly in front of Sultan Suleiman, whose mind was already heavily poisoned by deep paranoia and fear of being overthrown. For Suleiman, this was the absolute final straw. There was only one penalty for absolute treason. Mahidevran's flawless, vast intelligence network had miraculously managed to detect this approaching political cataclysm. When she realized that the Sultan was not actually gathering the massive imperial army for a Persian campaign, but was actually marching to take her son's head, her entire carefully constructed world violently collapsed. When Mustafa was officially summoned to his father's massive military camp in Ereğli in the cold autumn of 1553, Mahidevran passionately, desperately begged him not to go. She cried, held his arm, and pleaded on her knees. All of his trusted military advisors desperately warned him that certain, inescapable death awaited him in that tent. But Mustafa made his incredibly proud, undeniably tragic, and fatal decision, stating firmly, "If my time has come, I cannot escape it. If I do not go, then I truly become a rebel against my father." Refusing to run like a coward, he mounted his majestic white warhorse and rode with dignity towards his father's camp. As Mahidevran watched her brave son ride away into the dark horizon, she helplessly watched the 38 years of walls she had built to protect him, all her intelligence networks and all her maternal hopes marching straight into that dark executioner's tent. Chapter 5. The Road to the Tent and the Bloodline Purge. October 6, 1553. Konya Ereğli. As Prince Mustafa proudly rode his majestic horse into his father's colossal military camp, the elite janissaries greeted him with the ecstatic, deafening fervor usually reserved for a true, reigning emperor. Ironically, the army's overwhelming, passionate love for this young warrior was exactly what accelerated his tragic execution. The moment Mustafa settled into his private tent, a mysterious, anonymous warning was suddenly shot into the wooden post via a silent arrow. The desperate note explicitly warned him that his aging father fully intended to murder him inside the imperial tent. But Mustafa, assuming this was merely a psychological trick played by Rustem Pasha to incite his soldiers to rebel, dismissed this final warning. Meanwhile, heavily guarded at the far rear of the massive military camp, a woman waited with her heart in her throat. Mahidevran Hatun. With a mother's piercing, terrified intuition, she knew perfectly well that it wasn't a father's loving embrace waiting inside that dark tent, but absolute, cold-blooded death. Helplessly, holding her breath, she stared at the entrance of the imperial pavilion. When Prince Mustafa stepped into the grand tent wearing his immaculate white garments, a traditional symbol of his absolute innocence, he was met with a terrifying, suffocating silence. His father was hidden away behind a heavy silk curtain, and waiting for him in the deep, suffocating shadows were the Sultan's elite death executioners, holding the deadly silken bowstrings. But Prince Mustafa did not surrender easily. He was a powerfully built, fearless warrior who had been rigorously trained for years in brutal combat. The heavy tent walls shook violently, and silent, desperate screams filled the air during the brutal, agonizing struggle with the executioners. It was a desperate fight for survival that felt like an eternity. The chaotic struggle lasted so long that Sultan Suleiman, watching the gruesome, heartbreaking scene unfold from behind the curtain, could no longer bear the agonizing delay. According to reliable historical accounts, his paranoia exploded, and he peeked out, furiously yelling at the struggling executioners. "Ah, you dog! Do you still dare to salute me?" And then, a profound, terrifying silence of death fell heavily over the camp, deafening the ears of the thousands of loyal soldiers outside and the helpless Mahidevran waiting in her carriage. The silken bowstring had successfully choked the life out of the brightest, most beloved prince in the entire history of the Ottoman Empire. When Mustafa's lifeless body was unceremoniously brought out of the tent and laid on a Persian carpet, the massive military camp instantly turned into a colossal funeral home. As the fierce Janissaries wept uncontrollably for their fallen hero, throwing their turbans on the ground in grief, the dark, dangerous footsteps of a massive military rebellion began to echo. For Mahidevran, the world simply stopped spinning right there in the dusty mud. Her only beloved child, for whom she had sacrificed her entire life, her youth, her pride, and all her formidable intellect, was gone forever. She was no longer the proud mother of the future Sultan. She was now merely the despised mother of a condemned traitor. But Suleiman's deeply ingrained paranoia and Hurrem's merciless, calculating palace politics were not satisfied with just one death. To absolutely ensure the furious Janissaries could never eventually rally around a living symbol of revenge, an even darker, much bloodier imperial decree was ruthlessly signed in the shadows. In May 1554, the ultimate, horrific tragedy struck. Mustafa's innocent 8-year-old son living in Bursa, Mahidevran's only surviving grandson, Prince Murad, was also violently dragged from his bed and strangled to death by the same deaf executioners to completely sever the bloodline. Mahidevran's royal bloodline had been systematically and utterly eradicated from the face of the earth. Stripped of all her royal dignity, her massive properties entirely confiscated as the mother of an executed traitor, she was sent into a horrific, permanent exile in Bursa. The darkest and most miserable years of her life were just beginning. Chapter 6. From the mud of Bursa to the tiles of Muradiye. Permanently exiled to Bursa after her son's tragic execution, Mahidevran Hatun became the last imperial consort to retire to the old capital. However, this forced retirement was not a peaceful retreat for a grieving mother, but the dark beginning of a horrific, agonizing poverty that would mercilessly last for more than an entire decade. Because her son was officially branded a traitor, all of Mahidevran's revenues and properties were aggressively confiscated. Merchants in the Bursa bazaar cruelly refused to give her and her servants basic bread on credit, and they were frequently shoved and humiliated in the streets. This once incredibly mighty woman, who had practically ruled half the empire and masterfully managed a massive shadow state in Amasya, couldn't even pay her basic rent for exactly 10 agonizing years. She was forced to endure the daily, painful insults of her impatient landlords while shivering in a cold, crumbling house. But in a deeply twisted, almost unbelievable irony of historical fate, Mahidevran's ultimate restoration of imperial honor would eventually come directly from the hands of her absolute greatest enemy's son, Prince Selim. When Selim II ascended the throne in 1566, he made a shrewd political move to appease the unyielding anger of the army over Mustafa's death. He officially paid off Mahidevran's accumulated 10-year rent debt of 34,200 silver coins from his personal treasury, and granted her a handsome stipend. Furthermore, in 1573, Sultan Selim commissioned the construction of a breathtakingly magnificent tomb in the historic Muradiye complex in Bursa for his half-brother, Prince Mustafa. Finally, after 20 incredibly long, painful years, Mahidevran had secured a resting place truly worthy of her warrior son's memory. This stunning tomb was richly adorned with the rarest Iznik tiles. As soon as Mahidevran regained her financial independence, she established a massive endowment to ensure the Quran would be recited eternally at her son's grave. But the greatest historical document that reveals Mahidevran's true, noble character and deep compassion to us is the Itıkname, the official emancipation decree, issued immediately after her peaceful death in 1581. This heart-wrenching document details the terrible physical scars on the faces and arms of the 20 Bosnian, Russian, and Circassian slave girls who were granted their absolute freedom upon Mahidevran's death. For years, popular history spun malicious lies that Mahidevran had violently abused these girls out of sheer frustration. Yet, archival research proves the reality was far more noble. Even while suffering immense financial hardship during her exile, Mahidevran specifically bought wounded, scarred, unsellable concubines, girls brutally tortured by slave traders, and gave them safe sanctuary in her home. She wasn't a cold-hearted, vindictive woman. She was a deeply grieving mother who, after violently losing her own child, tried to heal her own shattered soul by lovingly sheltering these broken girls. And as she passed away, her final, uncompromising will was to ensure every single one of these orphaned girls was granted absolute freedom. Mahidevran Hatun bid her final farewell to this cruel world on February 3rd, 1581, at the advanced age of 82. After a lifetime of absolute power, devastating loss, and silent resilience, she was finally buried at the feet of the beloved son for whom she had sacrificed her entire existence. A woman proud enough to defy a world emperor, devoted enough to taste every single bite of her son's food, and compassionate enough to embrace the broken and the wounded. Mahidevran Hatun's story proves that Ottoman history isn't solely about Hurrem Sultan. It reveals the profound, silent, and devastating tragedies that lie hidden beneath the colossal, ruthless war for ultimate power. So, what do you think? If Mahidevran had pursued a politics as merciless and ruthless as Hurrem Sultan, would Prince Mustafa have walked out of that dark tent alive? Or was her only fatal weakness putting her maternal compassion above her raw ambition? Share your thoughts with us in the comments. Until we meet again in these dark, secret-filled corridors of history, don't forget to subscribe to History Whispers. Goodbye.